Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled Carbon Dioxide Removal Concept and the Way Forward with Young People. So I'm Béatrice. I'm a member of YOUNGO for 1 year now and one of the contact points of the Technology Mechanism Working Group within the YOUNGO constituency. And I will be the moderator of this webinar tonight. So this webinar is a special one as it's the first one we co-host with C2G, Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. And so I will let them introduce a little bit more C2G activities through the persons of Mark and Michael. And so to have this collaboration with C2G tonight is really important for YOUNGO, as it can allow us to gain knowledge about climate altering technologies such as carbon dioxide removal or also solar radiation modification. And yeah, just share knowledge about it and learn about those technology quite unknown, and also launch debates among young people. So just before we go straight to the point and talked about carbon dioxide removal, I just want to remind you that if you have any questions or remarks, we will let you ask your question at the end of the webinar after all the speakers made their presentations. And if you have any question, you can just put a Q in the chat. If you have a remark, put an X. If you want to support what has been said, you can put a plus. So if we go straight to the point now, we're going to talk tonight about carbon dioxide removal. So you may have a lot of questions about it, like, is it nature-based or technological solutions? How many types do we have as carbon dioxide removal technologies? And how do you feel about them? And how much do you understand them? So before we start showing some presentation about it, I would just share my screen and show you a little video, introduction video about CDR. So now that we had this short video, I will just give the floor to Mark Turner and Michael Thompson to talk and introduce a bit more C2G and the concepts of governance. First, maybe I will just introduce them quickly. So Mark Turner is the Director of Communication at C2G, and he previously worked as a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times before moving into communication, including periods with Avas.org, the International Organization for Migration after the Haiti earthquake, the International Renewable Energy Unit, CR, and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And Michael Thompson is Senior Outreach Manager at C2G. And before joining C2G, Michael was a co-founder of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment, a researcher at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and a policy advisor with the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Energy and Resource Institute in Delhi, India. So now I will let you present the concept of governance.
Hi, hi, and it's really great to see you guys here today, and thank you so much, Béatrice, Ajith, everybody who's helped put this together for YOUNGO. It's really a great time to be discussing this, and Michael will tell you a little bit in a second about the sort of carbon dioxide removal moment that's happening right now in terms of how people are discussing. I just really very briefly wanted to give a sense to you of what we are in the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. Our mission is to seek, well, to catalyze the creation of effective governance for climate altering approaches, in particular for solar radiation modification and large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We are guided in this by various principles. Crucially, we are impartial. We do not have a position. We are impartial about the potential use of any of these proposed interventions. These are choices for society to make. What we're here to do is help catalyze the governance. This is an infographic we have about governance. And just to say, because it's a very broad concept, it's more than governments. It involves lots of actors from all sorts of backgrounds: academia, media, government, business, civil society. It involves lots of diverse people and groups coming together to learn and then discuss and take decisions. The IPCC, in its special report 2018 on 1.5 degrees global warming, called it a comprehensive and inclusive concept of the full range of means for deciding, managing, implementing, and monitoring policies and measures. It can take place at lots of levels, from the global to the local. It considers risks against risks, the risks of doing something, the risks of not doing something, what synergies there may be with goals you have, what trade-offs, what interlinkages. And it can have lots of different outcomes. It can have outcomes to lead to less of something or more of something, or to do those things differently. So that was just a very brief introduction to give a sense that governance is a big concept, and what we're doing here today and the role that young people might play in learning and discussing and perhaps taking decisions and influencing what happens in the UNFCCC or anything else is part of governance. So we're really excited that you're here. And Michael, perhaps you could just say a word or two about the work you're doing around the world with civil society on CDR.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And I'm also very excited that we're able to participate in this, and glad you all have pulled this conversation together. So I'll say a bit about the work we're doing globally with civil society, but I also just want to say kind of an overall message that, you'll hear today. I think deciding what carbon removal looks like, how carbon dioxide removal is done, is going to be a major responsibility for climate justice advocates kind of in the very next few years. So that means that youth will have a major role to play. So right now, what we're seeing around the world, and you're probably familiar with this, is that kind of research is getting started, money is being spent, narratives are being written, and you'd likely seen kind of a flood of recent announcements from governments, corporations about making use of carbon dioxide removal to fight climate change, or as part of their own pledges towards net zero. So the point is, this is not an issue for a decade from now. This is something that will be important for you to shape in the near term. So as Mark referred to, C2G and others working with partners have been leading or taking part in meetings before COVID in person and now virtually, with climate action advocates all over the world, including the African continent, South Asia, Southeast Asia, basically making the case that these are important issues now, and that groups and countries have a role in shaping them. And we want them to get involved in shaping these things so that they're not playing catch up for years, but rather have a seat at the table and have these things work out the way that they want to. So with that, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it over back to Béatrice.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Mark and Michael. Really interesting. And now, since youth is our main preoccupation tonight, I will let our YOUNGO speaker and youth experts of this webinar, Gideon Futerman, show us some method and practice of CDR. So I will just introduce Gideon really short. Gideon Futerman is new member of YOUNGO, but excited to get involved. And he's the president of World Wards, as well as a volunteer for Natural Climate Solutions, both focusing strongly on CDR, and he has been in the CDR space for a number of years now. He is currently a sixth form student studying at Emmanuel College, just north of London, England. So I will let you speak, Gideon.
So yeah, I'm just going to be kind of doing a short presentation on CDR and youth. Essentially what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be starting, and most of the presentation will be talking about CDR techniques. How do we carry out CDR? I picked about 5 to go through, only go through them very briefly, and obviously there's many more techniques out there as well. Then I'll briefly talk about some different conceptions of CDR, although I think we'll be discussing that more later. And then I'm going to also be briefly discussing current and potential future youth engagement on the topic of CDR, obviously carbon dioxide removal. So the first kind of, I think, technology a lot of people think of when they think of carbon removal is tree planting. It takes in carbon dioxide and it releases oxygen, seemingly to do exactly what we want to do with carbon removal. It's also got lots of different co-benefits, increasing biodiversities. You know, we could derive a lot of medicines, a lot of other things from trees as well. It could protect from flooding in different areas and their impact and reduce that impact. And there's also economic opportunities associated with forestry. It seems to be a lot of people find it politically very attractive. This is different in different countries, obviously, but in many countries, tree planting isn't a particularly contentious issue. In other countries, it is. So that's both the pro and the con. And also, seemingly, there's a degree of scalability to this as well. We can plant a lot of trees, it is possible. We've cut down a lot of trees, and if we replanted them, that's called reforestation. And if we planted trees where we haven't cut them down, that's called afforestation. But it seems like we can plant quite a lot of them. On the other hand, though, there's quite a large number of cons against tree planting. You know, we don't understand actually, as much as we understand the basic process quite well, we don't understand fully how much that CO2 is actually stored, because trees also respire as well. They also therefore release CO2 from themselves, but also release it if you plant them in the wrong places, particularly if you plant them in places like peat bogs. They can release a lot of methane and to a degree CO2 into the atmosphere as well as other greenhouse gases called volatile organic compounds as well. That seems to not reverse the positive effect they have, but it means that their positive effect isn't as much as it might have been. If you plant them in the wrong place, that can be very, very bad. They also, trees tend to be quite dark as well, as opposed to other surfaces, particularly like grassland. So if you plant trees in places with historically grassland, that can decrease what's known as the albedo of the Earth, how easily light can be reflected. If it does that, and it absorbs more light and heat, that can actually help to increase the warming. So even if it's removing CO2, it can actually have a negative, potentially, if you plant the wrong trees in the wrong place, actually increase rather than decrease warming. It can also, by taking up a lot of land, as much as it's scalable, that can be a real threat to food supply, although different conceptions of farming may be possible to help this work, and also impact biodiversity as well. If you're planting on places which are planting monoculture plantations, on places that were historically grassland or other ecosystems, which are also very, very valuable biodiversity-wise. And finally, trees can get saturated. There's a point in which forests stop actually removing CO2. They tend to kind of remove as much after like a certain number of years. We don't quite know where this point is yet, but it's not in the realm of 100 often. That's why, you know, that's often why before we started releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, the mass amount of forests in the world weren't causing cooling. And finally, they're also impermanent as well. Trees burn, as we've sadly seen a lot around the world recently. That releases all that CO2 that they've taken up, or at least most of it, back into the atmosphere, meaning we might think we're okay with having removed a lot of CO2, but actually they're impermanent. So then I'm going to briefly talk about another solution that's potentially been proposed, which uses a similar-ish technique, i.e. photosynthesis, but uses it in a very different way. This is called BET storage. Essentially, the premise is that you grow biomass, so you grow trees or you grow plants, other sorts of plants, or even in some conceptions, algae, although that stuff's kind of still coming through. The technology's not even close to there yet. You then burn that at a power station and remove to create this bioenergy, which you can then use. You then remove the CO2 from the smokestack, and then you store that underground. You can remove it using conventional CCS processes, although at the moment that's quite expensive. So that's the basic idea of this technology. Let's see if this is going to work. There we go. So what's its pros and cons? Technologically, it's kind of easy-ish. as in we seem to have the CCS technology available, unlike some of the other technologies I'm talking about, which are much less developed. This isn't fully developed yet, but and we also have some of the supply chains in place because we have some degree of bioenergy going on already, and there's again some degree of existing expertise. This still needs to be improved, but compared to some of the other technologies I'm going to talk about, this definitely is the case. Energy is produced, which we can then use as a saleable product, potentially meaning that this isn't costing as much as it would do. But I think the biggest pro of this is the CO2 is permanently stored. We store the CO2 in geological formations underground, meaning that it's stored permanently. So, and that you know, these sinks, these wells we're going to be storing underground, they're not going to get saturated. They're not going to stop removing CO2 like we were saying with tree planting, or if you did things related to soils. I don't have time to talk about that today, but soils can also get saturated. And the IPCC talks about this, although the reasons they're talking about it may just be to simplify their models, and because they seem to use this and more natural solutions as their only two examples of CDR. So it's not necessarily as much of an endorsement of BECCS as it might seem. What's the cons to it? Well, I think the key con is land use issues. We need to plant a hell of a lot of crops or trees, whatever we're using to power this. That uses up a lot of land. That land could be used for foods. There's significant food security issues, and so they're associated with that. There's significant climate justice issues with regards to BECCS as well. It can destroy natural ecosystems because, again, we might be clearing savannas, or might be clearing forests even to plant these crops for BECCS, which could actually have a negative climatic impact if we don't do this well enough, but also could have a serious impact on the biodiversity crisis, which we know is very important. So therefore, there's questions of actually how negative this will be, given the amount of land we're taking up. Not only is there an opportunity cost, we could be using that land for tree planting or things like that. There's also a cost in terms of actually, you know, we might be planting these in places where actually that's releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Therefore, there's real issues with its scalability of this. There's also issues with the scalability of BECCS at the same time as having tree planting at scale. Both of them use a significant amount of land. Cool. So I guess something that is similar in a way and is very different in another way is direct air capture. It's similar in that the CO2 is stored geologically underground, and this works essentially by using chemical sorbents and kind of things that look sometimes like giant reverse fans, although there's some conceptions that look more like these kind of, I guess they call them artificial trees, that essentially sucks the CO2 out of the air by passing the air over these sorbents, which react with the CO2, and then you can do another chemical process, normally by heating, to release that CO2, and then you can store that underground. It's quite a simple process, essentially, like the simplest removal that you probably think of in terms of just directly removing. It seems quite scalable because it's modular. You can basically build as many of these as you like. There's not the land use issues associated with it. The CO2 is permanently removed, which is fantastic, and it's permanently stored, again, similar to BECCS. And you don't have the same land use and therefore not the same climate justice issues associated with direct air capture as you do with the other two that I spoke about. But at the same time, it has cons. At the moment, the technology is in its infancy. I think we've got 2 companies on them at the moment who have actually got functioning plants. I think there's currently 3 functioning plants, 2 in Switzerland, 1 in Canada, there may be 1 more. But it's very, very much in its infancy, this technology. It still needs to get, and that means that it's very expensive at the moment. I think the cheapest estimates are putting it at something like $90 a ton, and more expensive ones are into, you know, $200–300 a ton and even higher than that. And also to do this, you'd require, at scale, you'd require to use a huge amount of materials and a huge amount of chemicals, some of which we might just not have the capability to generate them. And actually, that also may release some CO2 into the atmosphere. And another pressing issue, more pressing issue, I think, in terms of climate-wise, is this would require the use of a huge amount of energy as well. And if that energy wasn't generated from renewables, that would be putting a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere in an attempt to remove it. I think I've seen a study that said that if coal was used to power one of these power plants, that would have actually a positive impact on the CO2 concentration, so actually putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. While if natural gas would, the removals would be cut by 1/2 as opposed to if renewables were used. So that's but there's other conceptions of it as well, which might use renewables. But if you use renewables for this, you're taking it away from other purposes that it might also be used to decarbonize. So another proposal which I think people have been getting quite excited about recently is enhanced weathering. You mine a rock, often a rock called olivine and sometimes basalt, although olivine is more effective. You spread this rock somewhere. Often you spread it on beaches, as you can see in this example, or you spread it on cropland, or can be put in these kind of, they call them reactors, which are often again on the sea, but are slightly different conceptions of where you to spread it. There's many different ways you can do enhanced weathering. It reacts with the CO2 in the air, or often CO2 dissolved in water that falls on it or goes onto it. And if you put this in water, there's a kind of related technique called ocean alkalinization, which instead, removes CO2 and from the ocean and stores it as bicarbonate in the ocean. So there's potential for this. Its pros: enhanced weathering EW, that's why that's at the top, is it's scalable potentially because it doesn't have those land issues associated with it, because all you're doing is putting a rock, and you're putting it on a huge number of beaches, which could actually help be a net positive. There's there's some conceptions of it on farmland, enhancing that, ideas that it could potentially enhance the value of that land, make food production easier, and therefore it has economic incentives to be doing this. There's almost no land use issues associated with it, which is fantastic. Supply chains, i.e. mining, exist already. It's one of the largest human impacts on the environment, and therefore it's not inconceivable we could mine rock on the scale that we need to do for enhanced weathering. And the removal, because it's stored as rock, is almost permanent, essentially. At least on the timescales we're talking about, it's essentially permanent removal of CO2. Whilst it does have a lot of cons. Firstly, it's in its infancy. We don't really know if this will work yet. In theory, it works. We don't know if it will work yet, if it will be effective or not. We know it will work on a large geologic timescale because this is the way that nature naturally removes CO2 from the atmosphere. But we can't be waiting hundreds of thousands to millions of years. We need to be doing it in human lifetime scales. But there's also issues associated with mining, huge amounts of human rights issues and social justice issues and environmental issues associated with mining. So this may not be compatible with climate justice in that regards. There's potential ideas that rocks like olivine, the most effective rock, is toxic and releases, I think, chromium in particular. But there's not enough supporting evidence to really say either way for this. And there's a question of actually how efficient this will be, particularly in farmlands and in clay soils in particular, where clay minerals may bond to the minerals within the rock, stopping it removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's questionable from there. And the final one is I'm going to be discussing today is called ocean fertilization, where essentially we add compounds that currently limit the growth of plankton in the ocean, and we can, particularly iron. We add that to the ocean to restore plankton blooms. These plankton should, in theory, and algae should remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. Then when they sink down to the bottom, that should, in theory, store that CO2 permanently. There's a lot of issues associated with it, though. But I'm going to first talk about the pros. In theory, maybe we could do large amounts of removals. We could utilize, and this kind of utilizes natural ecosystems as well. Naturally, these things exist. We're just trying to put them in places they don't necessarily naturally exist. It's at sea, so there's no land use issues, and potentially this could be very cheap. But there's serious issues with regards to how efficient this is, how actually this works, whether this does actually work. There's a lot of evidence to suggest this barely removes any CO2 at all. There's also a question of whether the storage here is actually long-term, or whether that plankton, before it gets to the sea bottom to be permanently stored, gets eaten, and then that CO2 just gets back released again. There's potential ecosystem damages, potential issues with regards to international law, particularly with regards to the London Protocol, although those things have yet to be settled. And a lot of people that are against this have branded around the term, calling this geoengineering. Whether you think that's justified or not for this is very different. Whether you think that's a bad thing or not, it's very different. But there's a lot of governance issues associated with that conception. Should we have the power to kind of play God with ocean ecosystems like this, to change them like this? would the changes be reversible, things like that. But that's some of the cons people have raised against this. Now, I'm just going to briefly, because I know I've not got much time left, going to briefly go through some conceptions of CDR. Some people have considered this as kind of an important part of reaching net zero, either as a backup plan if we don't reach net zero, don't look like we're going to mitigate quick enough, so we can remove to kind of backup plan, or we can remove in those sectors that we find really hard to mitigate. Sectors like, you know, I think startups like cement production, for example, or aviation or things like that. And some people, but this is probably slightly more problematic, have proposed for this to be a replacement for cutting emissions, even in not those hard to mitigate sectors. A lot of companies in particular have proposed that that's what we should do. Some people have proposed this as a kind of net negative idea, because we probably can't keep, actually according to IPCC, we can't keep under 1.5 degrees if we don't go net negative for a while and use CO2 and use carbon removal. So if you want to keep under 1.5 degrees, potentially even if you want to keep under 2 degrees, we're going to need to go net negative and use carbon removal. There's also some ideas being bandied around about climate restoration or climate repair, that we should actually remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere to help reverse climate change and actually help to restore the climate, not just to keep under 1.5 degrees, but go near enough back to pre-industrial. And that's associated particularly with ideas surrounding climate justice and decolonizing the atmosphere. This idea that, you know, putting wealthy countries putting their CO2 into the atmosphere is another example of kind of colonialism and the impact of colonialism. And therefore, if we want to truly decolonize, not only do we have to stop putting that in there, we've actually got to reverse the impact we've done, remove that historic emissions from the atmosphere. I'm very briefly now, as I said, going to quickly talk about youth and CDR. So the activists in particular at present. There's probably a large degree of support for natural, nature-based CDR, natural climate solutions as they're called, amongst youth activist groups. I've seen it amongst youth activist groups across the world, a significant amount of support for this. There's less support for CDR in general, although there are some organizations that I've seen that are supporting CDR in general, promoting CDR. So, but in general, I'd suggest most support for CDR tends to be quite narrow amongst the youth towards natural climate solutions at the moment. There are a significant number of organizations that are also against other forms of CDR. That particularly seems to be focused against techniques like ocean fertilization and BECCS, but there are some youth activist organizations that are, I'd say, that are against almost all types of kind of technological CDR. In fact, I'd suggest probably there are more youth activist groups against CDR, general CDR, than are pro it at the moment. Although more offers are pro natural climate solutions than are against all forms of CDR. And I think the overwhelming feature is, however, any other type of CDR that's not natural climate solutions is basically not mentioned. Most even will mention natural climate solutions as the 5th or 6th point in, you know, their campaigns and things like that. Many won't mention other types of CDR at all. So I think that's the real defining feature of youth engagement with CDR at the moment, is it's not really there. It's not really prominent. It's unique among almost all the areas of climate change that, you know, young people who are so active in every other area just aren't talking about CDR. This is why this is so important. You know, what could young people do in the future? Well, we need us to be innovating. We need us to be educating on CDR, maybe letting people know about all different sorts of CDR things. We need to be we're going to be the future decision makers, and increasingly are the present decision makers, and should be informed about the sorts of decisions that should be made about CDR. We should be engaging with policy, engaging with policymakers, and letting our voice on CDR be heard, rather than letting the issue pass us by and not mentioning it, or kind of passing it as an offhand comment, or maybe this, you know, isn't relevant, or this is, or, you know, you're not discussing this or whatever. We should be, you know, we could be very active in public discourse, be it pro or be it anti-CDR, or be it somewhere in between, or be it thinking CDR is a needless distraction, whatever. But that's just not there at the moment. And I see barely anything also from young people on social media who are so active and avid about climate change in general. I see almost no discussion of CDR. And I think that's where we come in, because as YOUNGO as well, because we could help to show the way in at least starting a discussion surrounding CDR, whatever way that forms. But currently, really among young people, there's not much of a discussion going on, or at least from my experience and from the organizations I've looked at in my part of the world and those others I've been in contact with. So that's the end of my presentation. Sorry for having to speak so fast. I had a lot to cover in a very, very short period of time, but thank you for listening.
So thank you a lot, Gideon, for this presentation. And now, so we will move quickly to another presentation before we have the round of discussions, because I want to keep like 20 minutes for the 2 rounds of discussion at least. So we will go to the presentation of Ugbaad. We will have the point of view of a more senior expert now. So for a quick presentation of Ugbaad before she starts presenting, Ugbaad Kosar is a senior policy advisor at Carbon 180, a DC-based NGO focused exclusively on carbon removal. She supports the organization federal policy work, finding ways to equitably and sustainably scale up natural climate solutions. And Ugbaad holds a master in forest science and renewable resources. So I will let us speak now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the great presentation and just setting up the conversation. I think one thing I really want to focus on is some of the justice and political considerations of carbon removal. I think there are a number of them that we need to talk about. It's really important to talk about how we're going to be scaling up these carbon removal solutions, really trying to understand, how do these pathways not only address carbon, but how do they impact social and environmental and economic outcomes for people? And how can we do it in a way that can really ensure that justice and equity is built in at the outset, but not put on as an afterthought. So just really making sure that climate action also improves outcomes for people, around the world. And there's a few different ways of thinking about justice and the term justice. There's procedural justice. So that's when you're making and implementing decisions according to, fair processes that ensure fair treatment. So really pushing that public participation process in decision making. There's also restorative justice, but the one that I really want to focus on is distributive justice. So when we're thinking about carbon removal, it's often we need to think about, who's going to get the benefits from these solutions, who is going to be stuck with the burdens or the harms, who's going to pay for these technologies, and where is this money going to be coming from? And you can think about that both in the public versus private sector, but also with the global community, the global north, and the idea of historical responsibility and what that looks like. And in doing so, and in paying for this, it's also who's going to own these technologies, and any of the information or the data or whatever may come out of that. Really just trying to push for that to also be open source, I think, is important. And these types of questions are going to have major implications about how this technology or how these different solutions are going to be used or deployed, and how will they either help redress social, racial, health inequities, or how are they going to further entrench them? These are really important conversations that we need to be having. Issues of governance as well, just broadly speaking. I know Mark brought that up earlier, but climate change is a global issue and carbon removal has global implications. And so we really need governance structures at multiple levels that are going to help address this, whether it's at the local level, talking about local communities and how they want things to happen, versus the international community. And each of these different pathways, as Gideon went through, they have their own set of trade-offs, and they have their own set of benefits, and they're unique to each solution. So we need governance structures that are able to really address this nuance. One other thing that was brought up is emissions reductions efforts, right? We know that emissions reductions is a priority, and it's something that needs to happen immediately. So how can we also think about carbon removal, and how can we scale up carbon removal in a way that ensures that it doesn't distract from meaningful emissions reductions efforts, right? And that it's additional. We know that these need to work together to really meet these climate goals. And in thinking about that, a lot of transparency issues come to play, and maybe some of those procedural justice issues come into play. So what does the decision-making process look like? Who's going to be in the room when we're thinking about different carbon removal solutions? How are we even choosing the technologies that we're going to pursue, and what does that look like? And then lastly is the accountability piece of this. I mean, ultimately, what happens if these fail, right? We need to be really adaptable. We need to be flexible. who's going to be responsible for that if that happens? So just thinking about, as we're scaling up and talking about not just the techno-economic feasibility and, the science behind it, but, focusing on more than just the carbon removal potential. Like, what are these other tangible benefits that we can get from making sure that we're really adaptable when we're reaching out to this? We saw that there's a range of different approaches and different scales across costs, across trade-offs. So just being really thoughtful about making sure that we're nimble. And I think one thing that's really important, and again, that came up a little bit in the presentation, but I wanted to reiterate, is the importance for conversations like this and the importance of youth to be engaged on this. I think youth have been absolutely pushing the needle on climate action around the world. And they're driving the conversation and are the leaders, in my opinion. And I think that, this generation is really refreshingly open to science, to stepping outside of the status quo, and just really understanding and internalizing and experiencing the very real impacts of climate change and what that actually looks like and means. And so really leveraging those perspectives is going to be really important to show up for the decision-making process. So a major tool that the youth have, strong digital mobilization skills and really innovative communicators. I mean, I've seen the way that you activate peers using like Twitter and Facebook and all these other outlets. So just finding creative ways to also engage with your communities and your peers on carbon removal, and ensuring that information is flowing, and that communities really understand what is carbon removal, what are those trade-offs, and just really help them make those informed decisions for themselves. So just really trying to leverage those skills and bring that conversation up with the rest of the climate action conversation. And just one other thing is, I think Michael brought it up again, it's happening, right? We're seeing money flowing in, we're seeing decisions being made, and we don't want to continue having conversations and continue doing things as usual without really expanding who gets involved and who gets a seat at the table. And I think with carbon removal, the nascency of it really does create an opportunity for all of us to really shape those policy decisions around carbon removal and its deployment, and just really make sure that it's done in a way that addresses inequities instead of continuing to contribute to them. So I think it's a really important thing that we're talking about, and I'm excited to see how this shapes out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ugbaad, for this presentation. So now that we clarified a bit CDR and yeah, so some concepts about it, we are going to go to the first round of discussion. So now we will leave you the floor to ask your questions. The first round of discussion, which will last for around 10 minutes, will be about what are your concerns about carbon dioxide removal, and also what opportunities might you see with those technologies. So first, yeah, I can see that Asen, you raised your hand, so you can speak if you want, like ask your question.
Thanks, Béatrice. Thanks, Ugbaad as well. I'm very delighted to see my first time of joining climate change activities, Somali guys, especially from female, and I'm very happy to see now. I would like to ask Ugbaad from perspectives of Somalia, as you can see how Somalia deforestation has been affected, and we know our plants take part on CO2 reduction from the atmosphere. I like to ask Ugbaad, what do you see as perspectives of Somalia, even not having the ministry that concerns the environmental and climate change, but it undergoes in the office of the Prime Minister, which is hard quite to accessible. So in your perspective, Ugbaad, what do you see how climate change action is being taken in Somalia, and the youth perspectives which the youth can take in Somalia? Thanks.
Thank you, Hassan, for that question. I appreciate that. I think, so I want to preface by saying I'm not an expert in everything that's going on in Somalia, although my family is from there. I think one thing I just want to share is there is potential with carbon removal in Somalia, particularly agroforestry systems, and exploring that opportunity. I think there's a lot of silvipastoral work that goes on there. So finding ways to integrate agroforestry into the systems that exist is really important. But I think with issues of governance also comes in play with Somalia, and currently the way that, from my understanding as in the outside, the way that the government is structured right now, I think that the youth would probably have a little bit more momentum organizing amongst themselves. There's an organization that I'm familiar with in particular, Famine Resistors. They're doing a lot of on the ground work with youth on all sorts of climate change action questions and providing technical assistance and resources to them. So I think just getting in contact with these sorts of on the ground organizations and really scaling up things like agroforestry could be a pathway for folks in Somalia. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, great. It's weird because I saw that someone raised a hand too, but now I cannot see it again. Was it?
Hi, it was me, Shivangini Swaraj from India.
Yeah, I think also I saw Pradeep raise a hand. So maybe, yeah, go on first, and then I will just give the floor to Pradeep.
Okay, talking about reducting, carbon dioxide, so we can, basically go with electrochemical reduction of CO2. Basically, it is a green chemistry way of recycling CO2 by, back to reusable form of carbon. So, when we see that carbon dioxide concentrate drop in the atmosphere, so the earth become, cool, and here basically the environment and some water vapor falls out of atmosphere, and the greenhouse warming caused by the water vapor, it drops. So we can take this step by implementing the same through its roots by reducing carbon dioxide from our home. So basically we can promote smoking outside of the home, ditch the rugs, basically cooking without leaving any trace of ingredients used in cooking. And best part about reduction of carbon dioxide, we can go for all natural things using biogas and all. So I would put my point for this like this. And apart from that, purifying the air. So how we can do that? By planting more trees. So that would basically reduce carbon dioxide. When I said that I'm from India, so here we are facing a huge problem of pollution. So promoting plantation of trees can also help with that too. Yeah.
Okay, so but I'm not sure about your question here, or if you wanted to make a point, or do you want us to develop more about the solution of like maybe planting trees like the one Gideon talked about earlier, or?
Basically, I wanted to put my point regarding the reduction of carbon dioxide. So that's what I added. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I will maybe give the floor to Pradeep now to ask his question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Béatrice, for the invite. It's so late in India. Sorry, couldn't turn on my video right now. Just a brief of me, I work with the public policy team in India with the local governments and the government of India on electric vehicle policy. Right, I work with one of the leading startup in India on electric vehicles. I have a couple of questions to all the elite speakers and panel. Very simple. We have almost completed 2 million electric vehicle kilometers till date, one of the largest in the country right now. We want to understand how we can actually communicate this effectively to our users. Like, when I say the users, the urban citizens like who actually go for different modes of commute, right? So how we can actually effectively communicate with them, because until and unless we communicate well the impact that they can create by choosing be it electric or be it low carbon like or NMT, we can't actually reach the targets. That's my first question, how we can actually effectively communicate. The second thing is how we can actually measure the impact of what we are trying to do. Is it just like comparing the like we have some calculations that we did and we got like some 93,000 kgs of carbon dioxide removal for the past 6 months or 7 months of operation? Is there any other way that we can actually match whatever we are doing with our electric vehicle kilometers? Because I believe strong comparison and making everyone feel whatever they're actually doing by choosing such modes is very vital for us to actually scale this electric mobility transition. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I don't know who wants to answer the question of Pradeep about it. Like the first question, how to target.
Sorry, my internet just timed out whilst he was asking, so I couldn't properly hear what he was trying to say. Is there any way you could slightly repeat it? Apologies.
Yeah, can I repeat?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gideon. So the thing is, like, I work with an electric vehicle startup. The thing is, like, we want to understand how we can actually communicate effectively to our end users, like, how much of carbon dioxide removal that you're actually contributing for every kilometer of electric vehicle that you actually take. Yeah.
So I think something that's probably quite important to clarify at this stage is the difference between carbon removal and cutting emissions. Carbon removal is removing carbon that's already in the atmosphere, carbon that we've already put there for whatever reason. Be it we put that carbon there 200 years ago at the start of the Industrial Revolution, or we put that carbon in there yesterday by driving our car. We're not talking about cutting emissions, which I think is what you're more concerned with your electrical cars, or on the question earlier about switching out about cooking in the home and things like that. That's more concerned with stopping putting CO2 into the atmosphere, cutting emissions. While carbon removal is concerned with removing that CO2 that's already built up into the atmosphere. And so I think that's pretty key difference we've got to think about and why we need to be starting talking about carbon removal. So often we are talking about, and almost the entire climate discussion is about stopping putting CO2 into the atmosphere. But now I think we have to recognize we also need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere as well. If your electric car company would like to be part of helping to fund or whatever removals of CO2 from the atmosphere, then you can I think frame that in a way that you're not only stopping putting CO2 in the atmosphere by cutting the emissions by the electric cars, but also by investing in other methods removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And they have to work in tandem. You can't just cut emissions and you can't just remove CO2. If we will not stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, if we just cut emissions, we need to stay under 1.5 degrees. I think according to the IPCC, we need to remove anywhere between 100 and 1,000 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. For perspective, we are putting 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. So we need to be removing much more than even 1 year's worth of emissions as the entire globe, removing that. We are not even removing a gigaton yet. We're removing far less than that at the moment. So we've got a long way to scale this. But there's a really big difference, I think. This is what one of the things is pretty important to recognize here, between cutting emissions, which is vital, because we won't be able to get enough removals to remove all of the CO2 if we just carried on emitting at the same rate. But there's a difference between the two. We also need to carry on removals, because if we do that, just mitigate, just cut emissions, that's not enough. So that's kind of, I think a key point that's kind of come up from the last two questions is I think it's quite important that we can understand the difference between cutting emissions, stopping putting the CO2 in, and removals, taking the CO2 out.
Yes, so thank you, Gideon. I think it was necessary to make the difference that you made. And so, yeah, thank you for your clear explanation. So time is running, and well, first round questions were initially like what fear you might have and what opportunities you might see. So we did not really talk about that, but if you have like fear or opportunity, you can still share it now. Otherwise, we would just go to the second part of the discussion, which is more like how youth can engage in the discussion about climate altering technologies, and yeah, how can we engage more? How can we launch debates among young people and raise awareness? So I think the question of Timothy is quite good to start this second round of discussion. So his question was for any speakers, by what means and process should we engage the global voice of young people into the governance of CDR? So yeah, who wants to answer that? I mean, it can be also like someone else, like not only a speaker, someone else who might have some thoughts and idea. Just answer. It's just the way to think about how young people can engage more and raise his voice into the governance of carbon dioxide removal.
I mean, I can just share something really quickly.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier the idea of using like social media to activate peers and others. I think the first step is just the education, understanding what carbon removal is, understanding what the potentials are, what the trade-offs are, and having those conversations, whether it's just looking it up, looking up resources, reaching out to others that are working in the space and asking to have conversations with them. There are a lot of different organizations that do things like internships or other opportunities where you can get tied in and just learn more about the space, learn more about what the opportunities are. And then from there, going back to communities that you work with or places that you live, whatever it may be, and sharing that information that you've learned and activating others to get interested, and then perhaps then getting involved in local, government opportunities or ideas that are happening, or how they're getting engaged on climate action in your space is another way of doing it. But I would start off by just making sure you have a really good understanding of what carbon removal is, and plugging into spaces and using the resources online from other organizations that are doing this work, and asking questions when you're stuck on something.
Yes, thank you for this first response. Sorry, answer. So I can
just
see
wanted
that.
to add on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Second,
Okay. So maybe you can go first. So you raised the hand, then we will go for Mahi.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the first thing for environment or climate change, as an international youth ambassador to Antarctica, I can talk here, right? The change should start with us, right? First of all, we should know what is our own carbon footprint, right? As our famous Mr. Gandhi from India always says, be the change that you want to see in this world, right? Until unless we strongly believe that we are actually reducing our own carbon footprint year on year, I don't think so we can impact or influence governments or influence anyone, because I think that should come from us. Like, be it in the way that you're actually eating food, right? How much meat are we consuming? Like, at the same time, how much commute are you using? Public transport, are you using regular cars, or just for vehicles for short distance, right? Even for that matter, I don't think so we need so much knowledge. It's a very simple thing, right? How much of carbon emissions? There are a lot of online tools that are available. We can easily know our own emissions, right? I think basic these kind of things can go a long way. Personally, after my expedition to Antarctica 4 years back, I've reduced my meat consumption, and I completely gave up, and I haven't bought a car or anything. I'm just using for cycle to work for my workstation, and I've chosen a career to more work on sustainability or more electric mobility space, rather than working on other corporate high flying careers. Just an example. Be the change that you want to see in the world. That's the thing that I want to bring onto this panel. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you, Pradeep. Even though I think you talked about a little bit by cutting emissions, but yeah, thank you. So now we can go to Marie, as I said earlier.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, you can ask your question if you want.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Hi team, I'm Mahesh from India. This has really been an informative space for me. Thanking the elite speakers and panel for the same. My question being, I would like to know more about the on-ground organizations and movements that are concentrating on CDR.
I don't know what to answer. I'm not sure I understood correctly the question. So, but if you understood.
I can rephrase it, Beatrice. So
Yeah.
my question being, I would like to know more about on-ground organizations and movements that are currently concentrating and advocating CDR.
Okay, so you want to know more about organization, about so focusing on CDR. So
Yes.
yeah, so I don't know who wants to answer that. Up to you. Like it can be Mark or Gideon or Ugbaad, as you want.
I guess I can start. So
Okay.
I only know the organisations I know. I've not done any comprehensive assessment of all of them yet. So there are many others, and the others who've spoken could obviously pitch in. So I'd suggest there are, I think, broadly two types of organisations taking outside the government sphere that are working on this. You've got civil society organisations, and you've got companies and those working in the private sector. Obviously, you've also got governmental and intergovernmental organisations as well working on those. If we want to talk from a specifically youth angle, that number reduces significantly. Talking about CDR in general, there's many different organizations you can find in almost every country working on things like tree planting. I know in the UK, organizations like the National Trust work on tree planting. Other organizations like youth climate activist organizations like Extinction Rebellion also do some stuff around that as well, and actual local community stuff doing that. But working on CDR at large, as I'd said, there are actually very, very few youth-led organizations working on it. My youth organization, I run one called Worldwood. We're doing something on CDR, but there's, except for that, most working solely on CDR, there's not loads. I found from other youth climate strike groups, though, for a lot of the Fridays for Future groups, they do discuss a small degree of natural climate solutions. I know the UK one describes that. I know some of the other European ones do. I've not yet been able to look at some of the websites of those beyond that, and some of the American groups do as well. So there's some other organisations that do. Would any of the other people there? That's my knowledge. There's not tons in the youth space that I know of that really are working on CDR, which is why this is so important. Then I can pass over to one of maybe the C2G guys to discuss kind of beyond that, civil society organisations beyond that, if any of you want to talk.
Thanks, Gideon. I think maybe I'll just say that, everything you said tracks with our experience. A lot of the major civil society groups we've interacted with, for instance, in different parts of Africa, or different parts of South Asia or Latin America, are just now starting to figure out how they can plug into this space. And many of them, for obvious reasons, are already stretched thin with kind of fighting fires every day on climate change. But they are, I think, working diligently to figure out where they can plug in, how they can get the resources to plug in, and getting expertise. And so that is starting to happen, but there are not many, as Gideon said, organizations, especially youth organizations that I know of, and I think this goes for Mark as well, that are focused exclusively on carbon removal yet, though I hope there will be in the near future. And maybe Ugbaad can say a bit, because her organization is explicitly focused on carbon removal, and she may also have some thoughts here.
It's the same thing. There's honestly no organizations that I've come across, youth organizations that focus on carbon removal. What we have been doing is doing outreach to different groups, and a few of them are youth-led, grassroots movements that really just focus on climate change. and trying to bring them into the carbon removal fold and just providing a bit of that introduction. But other than that, I haven't seen any organizations, youth-led organizations or youth-focused ones that focus on carbon removal.
Thanks a lot, team. This has really been informative. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Maya. And so now we'll have the two last questions before we make a short conclusion. So it will be first, Shane. Sorry for my pronunciation. Shane.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Okay, perfect.
It's not really a question, maybe a comment on things that have been said before. So I totally agree that education is really the start, and that of course starts by educating ourselves, being youth. And then maybe as a next step, I would be like, okay, so considering what has been said, so there's not too many organizations focusing on CDR yet, so that the next step would then be like, yeah, educate each other, and like Ugbaad said, like use our networks and our social media that we're so but that we're using so well, that we're so proficient at using, and really broadening that message and getting it out there with a lot more youth. But then I was thinking also maybe it's would be a good time to the extent that it's not happening yet, educate policymakers, and I mean by that not only the technological perspectives. I don't know, maybe they're a bit more aware of that already, like funding research and stuff like that. But especially on some very important points that Ugbaad brought up as well. So the threats and the opportunities that there are in CDR, and making sure that at this point this also already reaches policymakers, so that they're before even implementing any measures, that they're well aware of what the risks are, and that they already know and see that this is also a concern of the youth. I think at this stage now that there is not too much going on about this yet, or not too many actual implementations, as have been said before, that now is really the important time to make sure that a broad perspective on CDR reaches policymakers as well. So yeah, it's not really a question, but yeah, any of the speakers or anyone else can comment, of course.
Yeah, so yeah, of course, if one of the speakers wants to come on it, you can go. Otherwise, we will go to the question of Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe it's also rather a comment. So also reflecting to what, or yeah, a bit also similar maybe to what Chaim said about policy or so intervention. And also like I wanted to respond to Pradeep, like, I mean, I really agree that like we have to like work on ourselves and individually have like more sustainable lifestyle and do personal choices. But I mean, to do bigger and larger changes, I mean, we need policy changes and you know, yeah, as someone mentioned before, like change governance structures. About CDR, I think it's really important to do also like engage to influence policy, like meet policymakers and influence something in this direction. Because I mean, I've been involved in like environmental movements since like 10 years, and earlier I had the impression like many were really skeptical and negative about things like solar radiation management and things like this. But now more and more like it's a wider thing, or we heard that like some are like ocean fertilization is still very like maybe more cons than pros, but some other techniques like nature-based solutions especially like really need them for like reaching the 1.5 degree target. So now like the more I learn about it, the more kind of positive I am, even if I'm maybe been more negative before. And this is also like thanks to that I've learned more about the topic. So I think it's important, as people have said, like learn more about the things, but I also think that don't like also try to influence policy and policymakers and reach out, like get organized in organizations or talk more about this to have a larger influence. So I mean, it's good to focus on an individual level, but at the same time in parallel we also need to work on like higher levels and influence governance structures and so on to have this kind of larger influence, yeah, on the climate. Thank you. Yeah, so it's more a question. No, more. This was more a comment. I mean, not so much a question, but if anyone wants to comment, feel free.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. But it's a good comment for the end of this webinar, because you talked about the fact that you were less skeptical and more positive about it as much as you learn about the climate technology. So it's a good sign. And so if anyone wants to comment, or maybe Ugbaad, Mark, or Michael, just make conclusions. Yeah, Mark, sorry.
That's okay. Listen, I just wanted to say I'm really, really excited that there's so many people on this call and starting to ask questions and explore on this really, tricky area. There's so much, not that we can teach you, but also that you can teach us about how to, explore and come up with, new ways of doing governance on this, and, influence the conversation and bring your questions and energy and so much. And this is going to be so important. So I just really almost had a question to leave it with, but I'm wondering, after, we all go home from this, I'd just be really interested, and please feel free to get in touch with Béatrice and Sajith, and us or Gideon or whoever, but how can we help you learn more about this peculiar group of techniques and approaches that we're calling carbon dioxide removal, which is a very specific one part of the equation. How can we help you learn more? Because we would love to help. How can discussions be facilitated between different groups? How can maybe positions be taken to influence governments and intergovernmental processes? All of this is open, and certainly our organization, Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, we are not here to say how to do it or what to do or what positions, but we are here to say, we need this society-wide debate, and this is such an important moment to get in on this, that, anything we can do to help you on learning, discussion, facilitating, whatever it may be, we're here to help. And please, we're very excited to see what you'll come up with in YOUNGO. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate everybody who's joined on this.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, it's a good point you raised, and I'm sure that many people will have some ideas to develop collaboration and launch debates about these solutions. So are there any other speakers wants to add final comments to this webinar? Gideon, Ugbaad, or maybe Michael?
I thought this was great, and I want to emphasize Gideon's great contrast between emissions reductions and carbon removal, and just keeping that top of mind when you leave this conversation, and remember that they're two different things, but that they need to work together is really important.
And I just want to follow on what Mark said. I mean, I think it's exciting that you all pulled together a great conversation and got some good questions, and fantastic to know that you'll be engaging this topic, and we look forward to interacting with you and learning a lot from you.
And I'd just like to kind of echo all these comments. This has been fantastic. So yeah, and I think if anyone has any questions, all of our speakers would be really, really happy to discuss anything with you. So please, if you've got any questions, email us. Remember the difference between carbon removal and cutting emissions, as Ugbaad said, but please, if you've got any questions, contact us, because we really want to hear from you and really want to be able to facilitate you all learning more and getting more and more engaged in this space. This is really exciting. Thank you all.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. So I hope that it has raised your interest in climate measuring solutions, and to do a kind of follow-up, maybe we can we'll send you a form to see how you want to continue this this kind of share knowledge about CDR and keeping being involved. I just want to say also that I know that I've seen that a lot of contacts and resources had been exchanged in the chat. So maybe we just gather it and send it in the YOUNGO mailing list, so everyone will have access to it. And also that the webinar was recorded, so you will have access to it. So I think this is the end now, if there is not a last question. And so thank you all, and thank you to the speakers. It was amazing and a great first webinar co-hosted with C2G. So really great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye bye, everyone.